Okay, so first of all, welcome everyone to this online webinar on global frontiers in research and education. And this is a webinar hosted by the Sociology Department of Durham University as part of Durham Global Week this year. In this webinar, we want to create a space where we can reflect on our international research collaborations and how we incorporate this research into our teaching, into our classrooms. So before we start, I'd like everyone to make sure that you've muted your microphones, and there'll be space and opportunity for you to ask questions or make comments later. We invite you to do so through the chat function in this webinar. We will be hearing presentations from 3 speakers. So we have Professor Gitanjali with us, who will speak about her research, and Dr. Sweeting as well, and Dr. Yana. And they will present for about roughly 10 minutes each. And then there'll be a time for questions and answers later. So we will hopefully come to your questions in the chat box in the final session. So let me just give you a brief introduction to each of our speakers. Professor Gitanjali Ganguly is a professor in our department, and she's also a member of the Center for Research into Violence and Abuse. And she will share with us her research about sexual and domestic abuse and feminist responses in India. We're also very happy to have Dr. Sweeting Kong with us. She's a co-director of the Center for Social Justice and Community Action, and does a lot of work in participatory action research. And she will be sharing with us about her research on with activists and their emotional journeys and how they navigate gender as they do their activism. And we also have the pleasure of having Yana Bakovic with us. And she is a fellow of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and the Humanities at Bard College in the United States, and also an editor of The Philosopher, which is the UK's longest running public philosophy journal too. And she will share with us about the role of universities in politically divided societies. So can I just invite Gitanjali, please start us off with your presentation.
Thanks ever so much, Alice, and thanks for organizing this. So I've just got a few thoughts which I'm going to put forward, if you like. When I was asked to do this and think about it in terms of key global challenges, obviously the area that I work in, but even independently of that, one of the greatest global challenges, in my view, is violence and abuse, particularly against women and girls in the world. Um, I will be talking about this in the context of India, which is one of the areas that I do research. I'm originally from India and I do research there. I also do research in the UK, particularly on racially minoritized women and girls. Um, so one of the when I was asked to do this, obviously this is more complicated than, or even more complicated than doing the sort of role of presenting your research, if you like. It's for me, the reflection on how to teach on these things is really quite timely, particularly in light of the geopolitical situations in the context of India. And I, in particular, have a pedagogic dilemma, which I've been facing for a few years, to be honest, but I think it's really come to the fore quite recently, or even more come to the fore recently in the context of India, with the rise of Hindu nationalist discourses, which obviously have had a huge role um, in reducing and eroding the rights of women and girls in particular, but also other communities as well, religious communities, caste communities, marginalized caste communities. So the pedagogic dilemma, which I will start with, and then hopefully if I have some time later, but also I'll come to it in the question Q&A, if there are indeed any questions or interest. And that is about thinking about how do we decolonize teaching, you know, obviously going beyond teaching lists, which means exposing students to wider ways of understanding social contexts. But that goes beyond exoticizing or looking at it as a problem, but also goes beyond romanticizing what is happening in terms of real practices. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So some statistics, obviously, just to put it in context, obviously preaching to the converted here, if you like. But the problem around violence against women and girls is a global context, is a global issue. It isn't confined to any particular part of the world. On average, more than 5 women or girls are killed every hour by somebody in their own family. 55% of all female homicides are committed by intimate partners or family members. To put that in perspective, only 12% of globally of all male homicides are perpetrated in the private sphere, and not all of them are perpetrated by women, even in the private sphere. Globally, an estimated 736 million women, almost one in three, have been subjected to physical or sexual intimate partner violence and other forms of violence at least once in their lives. So that's 30% of all women aged 15 or older in the world. Um, so my work is looking at India, and it's really, as I said, not a problem confined to a particular part of the world, but it's also important for me to focus on how violence against women and girls is entrenched in local and national context, but is also subject, obviously, to geopolitical influences, because the way we understand it is really, really key. So I am reminded here of um, the Nirbhaya rape case, which was, I want to say, 2018, where a young woman who was a physiotherapy student was traveling late in the evening uh, on a Sunday evening after seeing a film, went on a bus which she thought was a public transport bus in the capital city of India. But it turned out to be a private bus. She and her friend were attacked. She was raped and murdered, and she died. Now, this was not the first brutal case of rape and murder of a woman. Rapes take place on an average of one every 20 minutes in India, according to the statistics which are available to us. But there was something about this particular rape case that actually caught the attention nationally and internationally in the world. It became this huge focal point in all over the globe, as it were. And to some extent, that more than anything else, in the context of globalization, pushed the Indian state to take particular action policy changes in the context of rape. Not all of them were perfect, but these were taken. So my work in particular is looking at social movement responses to violence and abuse in India. So I worked on the Me Too movement in India, looking at the role of emotions, looking at how different generations I mean, not so much generations really, looking at sort of caste conflicts between feminists in the context and looking at differences and what feminism means when people disagree with each other in those contexts, how important emotions are in the role of um, uh, social movements and social responses. To me, some of these things aren't really spoken about that much. We talk about social movements as if they were quote unquote rational. Um, and talking about emotions in that context almost seems like you're talking about sort of things which are feminine and kind of difficult to talk about. But these are, for me, really important to do as well. Um, I'm also interested in looking at theoretical perspectives and how to adopt some of the theoretical perspectives from some South Asian sociologists and academics. So I'm thinking in particular of the work of Veena Das's idea of critical events. So I've looked at that in the context of feminist movement. For instance, the example I gave you of Nirbhaya rape case, what made that particular event, if you like, a critical event in Indian history and world geopolitics? What was the particular trajectory that actually led to all these things coming together? I'm also interested in Vinada's draws from the work of psychotherapist, social psychotherapist, I should say, Sudhir Kakkar, who talks about critical moments as well. So she talks about critical events, but he talks about critical moments and how the kind of historical and social just and political juxtaposition of different things happening. I am also interested, I've always been interested in Amartya Sen's incredible work on the capabilities approaches and the extent to which violence against women can be understood in the context of development and looking at it in terms of the freedom and unfreedom of women and girls who are subjected to violence and abuse, looking at it across the uh, life cycle. So, some of the research collaborations that I'm currently looking at is we are looking at ways in which we can possibly adapt some of the work that my colleagues in the department have done here around sexuality and gender and understandings of sexuality and gender in amongst university students and young people in the UK, but looking at ways in which some of that work can also take place and be adapted within the Indian context, particularly in what is a peri-urban Indian Women's University. So that if that happens, I think that's going to be really, really exciting. So I had hoped to talk a little bit about some of the key challenges in working and teaching across cultures or teaching about different cultures. So I'm going to just touch on that very briefly and hopefully we can come back to it later. Is the first thing is about the fears of exoticizing particular forms of violence and abuse in particular cultural context. So, for instance, dowry related homicides. When I talk about dowry related homicides in class, I'm always conscious about visions of women being set alight and the particular horror and the exoticization of those forms of violence and abuse and what it does in terms of um, making that into a particular issue, if you like. But in a way, what I'm more interested in talking about, or I'd like to end here, is what does decolonized pedagogy look like in this context? No, it's not just for me. It's not just exposing students and fellow researchers to particular forms of violence and abuse, but actually exploring this in a historic and contemporary form of geopolitics. In for India, it would take the form of understanding intersections of particular forms of violence and abuse that are complicated by the historical experience of imperialism. For instance, there is evidence that all post any society which has experienced colonization is at higher risk of domestic abuse. There is more domestic abuse in societies that have experienced colonialism and imperialism than in countries that have not. And we can go into the reasons of that. But also looking at the current context of Hindu right wing politics, which is aiming to use the rhetoric of decolonization to push back on women's rights and feminist approaches in the Indian context. So I'm going to end here, and if that's okay, pass on to Shweting, who's going to be talking about her research.
Thank you so much. I really like the flow. Let me try to share the screen. You would then start to notice, I feel like there's a lot of similarity between my research and Gitanjali's. So I hope that everyone can see what I have put on the screen. Thank you so much for having me to share a little bit of my research on gender and personal lives in contentious times in Hong Kong. I am an academic in social work and sociology. And quite often when I think about social work, or when people think about social work, you might be thinking about, oh, social work is about child protection, it's about adult safeguarding. They tick, do the assessment and put people through the systems to get the benefit or care that they need to support individual independent life. However, I think actually social work has got a broader global definition, which is actually the definition that I draw on in my teaching and also in my work. If you can see that this is the definition of global social work put forward by International Federation of Social Work, that actually draws very heavily on the principle of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, inclusion, and respect for diversity, etc. And I think the most important thing about this particular definition is it takes us beyond the very narrow clinical vision about what social work is and how we actually intervene and how we actually see social issues intertwined across political, public, social, and personal lives. And that speaks also very well to a British tradition of social work, which is called the radical tradition. One of the many things that they actually kind of talk about because of the trade union movements in the past and the history of all that, they ask the question, when we see everyday suffering of people, the private pain that we witness and observe, what are actually the public and social causes of it? And I think with these two things together, you will start to see how I approach my Hong Kong studies, particularly to look at gender and personal lives in contentious time as the right intersecting spaces where public macro politics actually shape or being shaped by everyday personal politics, gender politics, family hierarchies and culture, and all that together. And that basically shaped the lens that I take in my Hong Kong studies. I'm not going to talk about all the studies that I do in Hong Kong in the past 10 years, but I think it would be really good to highlight the importance of international collaborations, as Alice asked us to emphasize in this particular event. We started our interest in thinking about women's experiences in political participation, particularly in the umbrella movement, when the first time the outbreak of mass movement in Hong Kong got onto the front line, the headline of all the international media. We want to hear more about women's stories, women's experiences in political participation. And then through that process, we then recognize how much suffering that they have been through without being recognized in the public domain. And in that particular project, I think it shows so much about the importance of collaboration with universities in Hong Kong and also University of York, the team that has already established relationship with women activists for so many years, social groups and community support that have been given, to the activists in the past 10 years. Without the networks and the rapport and relationship already built with women activists, it would be impossible to actually, get access to the very intimate experience of how they navigate gender hierarchies in their political participation, let alone the very challenging political environment. And not just about that, because of the long-term engagement and the presence of people physically in the place where social movements took place, it allows us to have the longitudinal perspective to observe women's changes in perception of love and justice and how they then re-engage with collective action because of all those changes in perception of love and justice and all the other sort of ideas of righteousness, for example. So they are all very important. Without that, that would not be even possible. And also because of these collaboration, it allows us to see how Hong Kongers experience solidarity in social movement and translate that solidarity into their everyday life and carry on their activism when the bigger environment might not allow them to organize themselves to protest against the government. government. And the collaboration doesn't stop there, because we also realize there is the emergence of Hong Kong diaspora in different countries, for example, the UK, Canada, Taiwan, Australia, because of the implementation of the national security law a couple of years back, and also because of the movement of people from one city to other places. We started to build more collaboration with universities from other countries, as those I have just mentioned, in order to look at how transnational activism and transnational personal life is actually possible and supported. And that's the reason why we start building collaboration with UBC in Canada and also universities in Taiwan and Australia, to kind of look at how the impact of social movement actually move from one city geographically to other host countries. So this particular slide is just to kind of like emphasize the importance of collaboration. As I said, I'm not going to talk about everything I have done in the past 10 years, but I want to kind of use a particular triangle that I have shown you in the previous slide to talk a little bit about how this area of work has shaped my way in thinking about the role of social workers and what exactly is social work, or what it can be beyond the sort of institutionally regulated practice in this country. So when we started with the Women Activist Projects, a set of projects, the first thing we wanted to hear is actually women's experiences of participating in a social movement, which was back in 2014, the Umbrella Movement. Quite a lot of women, they talk about, of course, themselves organizing the people to go on protests and demonstrations, but also the less listened to or heard stories is how they got attack on the street, not just by opponents, but also by their by the supporters of the movement, but they might take very different strategies or approach to how they organize the movement. And they were called all sorts of things, including the list of things that I have put on the slide, and that I'm not going to kind of like say that out loud. It kind of exposed to everybody how women's body became the subject of attack, and also how it is used to undermine their political action and mobilization and contribution to a social movement. I think the saddest things that we have heard, from women's experiences is not just about how they got attacked and how those attacks are very much gender-based, harassment. It is about they found nowhere to talk about this suffering. And also the misrecognition, trivialization of gender-based harassments that they experience in political participation. Quite often, the response to them talking about these experiences is that, oh, come on, tough up, girls. This is the cost that you should pay for pursuing democracy, to address, to address the bigger inequality or bigger evil, in this world. And not just that, quite often their suffering is considered to be unimportant to the bigger picture of democracy. So we start to ask the question, are there hierarchies that tell people what kind of suffering is and what kind of victimhood is more worthy of attention, and whether some people's suffering are more grievable and some of those are not. We draw on a range of literature that I have shown here to reconsider actually the feeling of what is worthy of recognition and worthy of grievability has got a gender dimension in it. We published about this, so I'm not going to go into details of all that. But I think a quote here is actually very interesting, and it draws us to attend to women's suffering as the core to democratize, the practices of social movement. Cora, who has been through all kinds of movement organization from 2014 to 2019, and she said, if the movement is supported by people, the pain experienced by them should be taken care of. The movement can then be sustainable. And they also help us to ask, if we pursue democracy through social movement, protest, and collective action, what kind of democracy that is. Is it just for men, or is it really for all? And we also, by listening to women's experiences, we also realize how women are often placed into the political vacuum when male political leaders are persecuted and even imprisoned, but then they are often considered to be inferior political substitute. They come in and fill the shoe of the male counterpart, but they are expected to go when the male political leaders are released from the prison. And that kind of inferiority that underpins women's participation in political movement is also affecting how they consider themselves and their self-esteem as a political leader. Not just that, participating in political space with the expectation that they are just an inferior substitute also assume them the role as the carer for their imprisoned counterpart, and they have got the burden of care that consume them so much in their everyday life. And some of the women activists, they talk about how they got swallowed by the expectation to be the carer while they are also taking part in the political movement and continue to mobilize people. And also, they're not allowed to be sad because they have to stay positive for their people, but never for themselves. And I think all these together, one thing that we have realized is how powerful and agentic women are as well. They come together, form a group of sisterhood to try to acknowledge each other's suffering and to make personal pain relevant to the movement. If it is a movement for democracy, it has to be a movement for women as well. And also to create discursive space to articulate, why women's suffering have never been heard or at the center of a pro-democracy movement. All that together, I think it speaks back to the radical tradition of social work we started, is to think about the role of social workers beyond children safeguarding, child protection, children safeguarding, or adult safeguarding, but to think about the wider picture of social work intervention. And that's why I brought this case back to the teaching of Masters of Social Work. Come and join us if you're not yet a part of it. So what we are doing is to help students to think about, if you're in a situation like that, do you think social workers do have a role in social movement? Or how are you going to think about the idea of democracy, justice, and also gender equality in this very challenging mixed picture of women's experiences in political challenging times? And also, we use Hong Kong as a case to help us unpack the politics of social work professional practice as a regulated discipline in this country as Hong Kongers move from the city of Hong Kong to other countries, including the UK, to expose how unprepared the system is to support overseas qualified social workers to enter the workforce of the UK, and demonstrate actually when we talk about global Britain, a lot of systems are not actually as global as we wish. So with all the input from Hong Kongers and also from different Hong Kong projects, we are also developing a national program. Well, we have developed a national program. It's going to launch to support overseas qualified social workers to practice in the UK as one of the intervention as a social work scholar in this country and also as a migrant to bring experience from another place to shed light on the possible development in this country. I think that's how I'm going to run this up, hopefully not too much beyond 10 minutes. And I pass this to Jana.
Thanks, Shui Ting. I was going to say hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm afraid I'm going to be significantly underperforming or not meeting Shui Ting's standard with no PowerPoint, but I've prepared some materials that I will put in the chat for you. So if you're interested, you can look at that by saving the chat and then looking at them in your own sort of time or piece. So moving us on, one of the things that I think Alice, Alice did not mention, well, mostly because it goes without saying, I am an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at Durham. And I myself am international in the sense of my trajectory into UK higher education and research has been rather global. So I am from Central and Eastern Europe, and prior to coming to Durham, I have worked in Belgrade, which is in Serbia. I have worked at the Central European University in Budapest, which is in Hungary. I worked at Aarhus University in Denmark, during which period I spent some time at universities of Bristol in the UK and Auckland in New Zealand. And I worked at the University of Cambridge in the UK prior to joining Durham. So my own trajectory has been quite diverse in that sense. And one of the things that I became interested in as I was traversing these different contexts of knowledge production were basically two main things. One is how things become identified as global or universal in the first place, and how some other things become identified as regional or particular to the context. And the other is, what does knowledge in this sense do? So what is the relationship between knowledge, including the idea of what kind of knowledge counts as global, or on the other hand, particular, and any kind of social and political process, in particular political change? So today, what I'll be talking about to you, or giving you, I guess, sort of a taster of, is some of the theoretical work I've done, and then a bit of the empirical work I've done, and the kinds of public engagement that I'm currently doing that particularly relate to the role of universities, or in general institutions of knowledge production, as we tend to call them, in particular in politically plural or divided societies. And one of the things that I say is that often when we think about politically plural or divided societies, we tend to think of situations when there is, or where there is, open, explicit political conflict or post-conflict situations. And the place where I came from, former Yugoslavia, was very much such a context. And it was initially in this context that I became interested in the question of what can universities do? What is knowledge good for? Can it actually help us prevent conflict? Can it help prevent violence? Can it help build safer, better, more inclusive, more just societies? But as I was sort of traversing or making my way slowly towards the position in which I am now, I increasingly began realizing that, much like anything else, knowledge can be all kinds of things. So knowledge can be used for good purposes, and knowledge can be used for purposes that are sometimes meant to exclude or oppress, or definitely do not benefit everyone equally. So one of the things that I center in my work is this question of ambiguity. So what does it mean if something can be several things at the same time? And trying to deal or come to terms with that question of ambiguity is quite central. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'll just step back a few steps to say, speaking of what kind of counts as global, or what counts as local or regional, one of the things that I've published on is something that's known as, I'm trying to copy the link into the chat, something that's known as epistemic positioning, which is precisely the question of how we identify some things as kind of as central and some things as particular. When it comes to the role of universities itself, my work has moved from looking in particular at universities in contexts where there is or has been political conflict. That included in my empirical work former Yugoslavia, and that's kind of the main topic of the book that I've published with Central European University Press in 2014, which is called From Class to Identity: Politics of Education Reforms in Former Yugoslavia, and you can have the link to that is in the chat as well. It's kind of a case study or set of case studies that look at long-term political processes of transition between communism or socialism into something that we would today probably identify as neoliberal capitalism, and then looking at how that interacts with forms of political subjectivities. And within that context, I became interested in particular in this question of, well, what are universities good for? What are the links that we assume between knowledge and action, and how can they be used for good, and how we can prevent them from being used for perhaps not such good purposes? So I'm going to put another short link in the chat, which is about the question of what the relationship between knowing and predicting things is. It's a short piece that basically just help us orient the discussion, and looking at or moving beyond the context in which my research was initially empirically based, which was former Yugoslavia. I became interested in how universities in contexts or in societies that were considered democratic and relatively equitable and relatively inclusive were also, in a manner of speaking, becoming sites of contest or conflict. And as I'm sure many of you know, there are different sort of discussions, disagreements around what questions such as, or concepts such as academic freedom mean today. We are often faced with situations in which universities or people in universities encounter significant challenges to their own academic freedom. There are countries or, again, political contexts where there is explicit repression or censorship over what academics can say. On the other hand, there is also, and especially if you look at social media, you will encounter this framing of, cancel culture, or perhaps platform wars, that kind of thing. So the idea that there are limits to free speech and limits to what can actually be said within universities. And in this particular context, it's only, I would say, expected or expectable that people will have different ideas of what this is and different ideas what this should be. So one of the things that I've done recently and I'm still working on is kind of a project that has a dual leg. On the one hand, there is the analytical part of it, and that analytical part engages with the question of, well, okay, what does speech at universities actually do? And they'll put a link to that as well. I've recently published a piece on that basically analyzes the introduction of particular form of legislation that addresses the question of the relationship between academic freedom and freedom of speech within the UK. But I'm also running a series of events, talks, discussions with the journal that Alice has mentioned in the introduction, and that's The Philosopher. That is UK's longest running public philosophy journal, where I'm getting together with different people, some of which are people I started collaborating with when I started my fellowship at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College in the US, to really think about, well, what does it mean to think with others? What would it mean to think together in the context in which we accept that there are political divisions, that the society is politically plural, so that there is no chance that we would all agree on everything or even most things. So what kind of challenges does that entail? And how can we actually ensure that the very political and public role of universities is not erased or rendered impossible by some forms in which, or some forms that freedom of speech or academic freedom can take? In other words, how can we ensure that on the one hand, we have, or we create, maintain conditions for an open and inclusive discussion, but then on the other hand, that this discussion in and of itself does not destroy the possibility for everyone to participate in it. And I'm going to put as a kind of a final link, because I'm also mindful of the time. So I'm going to put a short piece that I wrote for The Philosopher, which engages with Hannah Arendt's idea of what does it mean to think, and whether thinking is something that we normally do in our own heads or in solitude. And I'm also going to put links to the two events, or all of the Philosopher events are always publicly accessible and free, and also posted on YouTube. So this is one in which I talk to two people, one of whom works on citizen assemblies, so forms of deliberation where people gather together and make decisions on whatever it is, and the other works on juries. So what kind of thinking together happens when people are on jury duty, in this particular case, mostly in the US, and I think to a degree in Colombia as well. I'm forgetting which exact examples she was using. And the other event, the other recording of the event, is also a discussion with two people. So in that sense, it's also a form of practicing thinking together as we're talking about thinking together. And that is on the relationship between reading together. So something that happens a lot at universities and happens a lot in different formats. One is obviously engaging with mandatory and hopefully additional literature in taught content, so in courses, but also happens through different kinds of seminars or reading groups or research presentations. And in what way can we ensure that that moves beyond, everyone just trying to demonstrate how smart or intelligent they are, and become something that can truly build a collective spirit. I'm just looking at the clock, so I think I should probably wrap up at this point. Alice has also suggested that we reflect a bit on how we put these this kind of research or work into practice when it comes to teaching. And as you may have noticed, I am a social theorist, and a lot of people tend to think that social theory is something that's abstract, does not deal with anything that's concrete, does not deal with empirical examples, can also be both very white and very exclusive and very male-dominated. And that is not at all the kind of theory that I do. So at term, I teach two modules. One is called Social Theory and Politics of Knowledge, and that's a third-year undergraduate module. And that module explicitly challenges or questions different things, including how knowledge is produced within and through theory. And obviously how the canon itself, so people who are considered foundational to theory became considered that, and what does that mean, especially in terms of decolonizing. And I'm going to just put a link to a short video where I talk about basically why is the canon white and male and what we can do to change that. There's some ideas about what we can change that. The other module that I teach is called Public Sociology, Theory and Practice. And in that module, it's a collaborative module, so other people contribute to it, including Alice, who is here. But among other things, what we do in that module is to make sure that we demonstrate how theories, including concepts such as injustice, inequality, gender, sexuality, etc., were basically derived from research that in some cases was not even back then considered sociological, but de facto was, including a lot of work in what Schweiting has described as social work. So how the very concepts and ideas for understanding social reality that we have did not, were not just presented from above or created by intelligent people, but rather were derived from actual research context. That is all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to any thoughts or comments.
Thank you so much for that. That's really fantastic. And I'm just going to put a spotlight on Schweiting and Jana and Gitanjali again. And I have a couple of questions for each of you, but I also welcome any questions from the audience. And if you have any questions or people within the audience, please do type them into the chat box. My first question, Gitanjali, for you is, could you share with us, you started on this already, and I would like to ask you for more, of your reflections. You share with us that you're careful about the way you position and talk about sexual and domestic abuse, and are also concerned about making sure that we draw upon theories from different locations and places in line with the sort of focus on decolonizing knowledge and power. Could you elaborate more about that, Gitanjali?
So, I mean, going to the first point, second point first, if you like, I think the reason why I choose the focus in particular theorists is not so much because I want to include non-white um, academics in the reading list, or the sort of understanding of what uh, understanding of the world is, but because I think that they are really key in general to help us understand not just Indian society but global societies, and can be applied to a variety of different contexts, and have indeed been applied to a variety of different contexts. But So that's the first thing as well. Uh, I think but it's also sometimes in terms of choosing to have put a spotlight on particular theories, on particular thinkers. So that's also important. So that's the other role that I also look at. For instance, you sometimes find misattribution of particular theories to sometimes white thinkers or male thinkers, when actually the genesis of them, if you pardon the word, is something which has been done elsewhere in another context. So I can give examples of that if people are interested. But I think the first point, which is almost more important, is that on the one hand, as somebody who comes from a post-colonial uh, nation, who grew up in a sort of post-colonial society, I don't particularly like the term post-colonial because I think it defines particular cultures in the context of colonialism. However, we also know that the history and the geopolitical positionalities of those countries have been transformed beyond recognition. We don't know what those countries would have been if they had not been subjected to colonial violence, just as we don't know what the trajectories of individual women and girls might have been if they were not subjected to gender based violence. We have no idea. But India is a survivor of colonial violence, and I've grown up in that context, sort of post independence. Um, so I'm quite conscious at that level. I remember somebody, when I was studying history years ago in Delhi University, somebody said to me, one of my professors said to me, we are all nationalists. If we born in a post-colonial society, we are all nationalists. And nationalism means something really different to us than it might mean than if you were brought up in the US or the UK. And that's always stayed with me, though I'm no longer an Indian. I'm British now, but I still have that sense. So part of it could be this thing of not wanting to misrepresent what India is, or present it in a way which is speaks to all the complexities of that particular history and the particular context that we live in at the moment. But I'm also conscious that it's very easy when we do that to make excuses, if you like, or for particular cultural practices that are problematic. So what is the product of colonialism? What is not the product of colonialism? Does that matter? Do we need to understand how colonialism and post colonialism and the rhetoric of decolonization is being taken advantage of by particular post colonial societies, which are using it to undermine the rights of women and girls and sexual minorities and religious minorities? Certainly, I think we need to do that. I think that is the second question, and we need to do that in a way that is reflexive in our teaching and our writing. I think that's the key thing that I would like to draw attention to. I'm going to stop talking now so my colleagues again also have a chance to talk as well.
Thank you so much for that, Gitanjali. I really appreciate those reflections. And I have a question from the audience, and I'm going to ask Sweeting to comment on this if that's okay. And the comment is as follows. How do we keep calm when we care a lot about the issues that we're researching? Because often we ourselves are drawn to particular issues, especially around social problems or feminism, and we are also moved into anger. So the question from a member of the audience is, is an observation that this can do great harm to ourselves, to our health, and to our bodies and mentally. How do we as researchers keep cool when doing research so that it doesn't harm our own health? Especially as we do research around violence. So Sweeting, I wonder if you could comment on.
Yeah, I would try. It's a very difficult question, really, and I think it's relevant to all of us, isn't it? I can't keep calm most of the time. I think that is a reality. It does actually kind of, I think quite often when the researcher is very engaged with the subject matter and you do really care about injustice, it's really hard to keep calm. But I think what you're asking is that what if it is starting to hurt your health and mental health? What is the feminist way to respond to it? I don't know what is there, but I think I've got a feminist way to respond to that is critical, radical self-care. I think it is very, very important to consider that actually we don't get consumed by work or sort of what we call the mission. Because what I have learned from all the feminist and women activists in the past is that they quite often, got demotivated in their work because of they are so consumed by the bigger discourse that you have to sacrifice all of yourself to the movement for the bigger democracy, the future of the people. But actually being able to see yourself being the seed and the possibility of change is very important. And kind of protecting that space for self-care and allow yourself to rest is actually, I think, incredibly important. And also it is to speak against that kind of very earnest culture, very capitalist culture to kind of ask you to be productive all the time and to produce more and more. I think that kind of space is important, and I do really consider that as a feminist way for activism, and I think that is part of it. The other thing that I have learned from working with a lot of Chinese feminists, be it still in the country or already left, they use a lot of writing, not necessarily academic writing or other ways to express their emotions as a way to heal. Jin Jinyan, for example, who is now in Sweden, Lund University, she does a lot of filming, photography, poetry as a way to kind of get in touch with your own feelings and using those feelings as a starting point to understand what is women's perspective in dealing with all these things and the injustice that we try to kind of shoulder in our work and personal life. I'm sure there are more other ways to deal with that. I don't know. I think probably Gitanjali and Jana might have some tips about that too.
Thank you so much, Sweeting. And actually, Gitanjali also put in a reference in the chat box for anybody who wants to follow up also, because you've also reflected on that in your writing, Gitanjali. We have time for one last question. And Jana, I'll ask this to you if that's okay. With all that's going on in the world right now, we see so much suffering and we see so much political contention and, debates that we're so frustrated about, and free speech and academic freedom seems so much more fundamental now. How do you raise these issues and what is the response of our students when you talk about the importance of free speech and academic freedom?
Thanks, Alice. I think it's a very good and a very complicated question. I think for us, as both academics and people who are committed to social justice, the key question really remains, what kind of good or harm can speech do? And in that sense, there is a theoretical question there that's always been interesting for me and connects to my earlier work, and that's the idea of what does speech do anyway? Because obviously in some ways, and other people in this department, including those in this meeting, also do with kind of forms of speech that are explicitly harmful, for instance, hate speech. But often we tend to think that academic speech is exempt from this or should be protected or cannot be as impactful as other kinds of speech. And I think the main question there is really to encourage students to reflect on the balance between the right to express one's views, which obviously in the UK we both support and is guaranteed by law, and I think is really important for, sort of open, inclusive, democratic discussion. And on the other hand, the way to express those views in ways that do not disadvantage people of particular groups or just particular people from participating in a debate. And as we know, or at least as kind of theorists of social inequalities of my bent know, any kind of collective situation can always become, or first of all, always involves relations of power, and second of all, can sort of very easily become pleasant for some people and unpleasant for others. And it's a really interesting challenge to try to balance those things, because it really addresses all things that it really, I think, points to the very core of what universities and education is about, which is what is the relationship, or how do we actually reconcile questions of knowledge, participation, inclusion, equality, and justice, and how we can do that in a way that benefits everyone, and especially how can we do that in a way that benefits everyone in a society or context that is increasingly and luckily more and more diverse. So it's the most difficult question of all. I like to think I'm one of the people who are hopefully contributing to offering some answers that are, again, more inclusive and more considerate of everyone who wants to participate in that discussion. But I think it is to a great degree, in a manner of speaking, a question that all societies will have to answer sooner rather than later, because it is the core question of liberalism as well as post-liberalism, which is how do we ensure that our institutions serve everyone, and what is it that we actually want to stand for.
I think that's really thought-provoking, Yana. I really appreciate that. I think we've come to the end of the session. I just wanted to offer Gitanjali, Yana, and Shooting just maybe one last observation from each of you of the topics that we've come to discuss today. Gitanjali?
I've just been listening, and it's really, really fascinating. I think for me, the question that Shweting answers particularly resonant for me, because it's the topic around violence and abuse is of great sort of it is a very difficult topic to work for, for various reasons, and I'm part of this incredible center, the Center for Research in Violence and Abuse. We all work on really difficult, challenging topics. How do we stay, I was going to say sane, but I don't know whether we can qualify for that. But how do we stay calm within that? It's very difficult. I think that the way to do that is to ground yourself in the research, um, uh, to because in a way it's about power, as Yana said, but it's also about the power that we have as researchers who are working in the West, and also holding particular institutional power over various people across the world in ways that are conscious and unconscious. We have to wear that. We have to hold that power, but we have to hold it both lightly, but we have to be aware of it. And I don't exactly know how to go whether that answers the question, but that's what I would like to say as well. Obviously, I have a lot of other thoughts as well, but I'd like to give my colleagues the time to uh, have their final last few words as well. So, Shweting?
I got inspired by listening to colleagues' work and the questions asked. And one of the many things I kind of like, it just couldn't get out of my head is about the complexity of decolonizing practices. It's not just about talking about decolonizing or resurrection of the past, which has been sort of politically misused by a lot of powerful authorities, for the harm of women and girls and general public. It is also the case of Hong Kong in the context of China. It is not like what Gitanjali talked about also happened in other places. And I think that is something that we need to kind of really pay attention to and make decolonizing as a practice historical, but also contemporary. That's what Gitanjali talked about, is to look at the intertwining power relations between the two constantly being reshaped. I think that is really a big challenge, honestly, for all of us. And that speaks to, what is considered to be, epistemic injustice, what knowledge being ignored. There's always like sort of power play in the contemporary sort of society that shapes, how we understand that and then what can be talked about and what can't be, what are the roles of university. It's just so much that I feel like I'm still thinking about. I don't have answers to them, but yeah, I appreciate, all the presentations and questions raised here. I think that would make it a good transition to Jana.
Thanks. I was going to echo this and say it's always, for me especially, much more sort of a source of pleasure to hear about other people's work than to have to talk about my own, because the latter I do quite a lot and the former not nearly as often as I would like to. But the one thing I would like to close on is possibly going to kind of go against the grain of a lot of the things that have been said, including that I've said, or maybe not. I think it's going to amplify them, which is to say that at the end of the day, we really need to bear in mind that just, knowing something or just researching something is really just one part of the equation. And in many ways, how we relate to one another, how we relate to the world, how we relate to other people, regardless of whether they're research subjects or students or part of the university or academic community or not, is what matters. And this is, in a manner of speaking, something that hopefully we should be using our, status as academics and the privilege and responsibility that it comes with for, in a good way. But we also need to remain attentive to the fact that this is not all there is, and in a manner of speaking, being a human being, as obvious as that should sound, extends beyond being an academic, and I think that that's what really matters at the end of the day.
So I just want to thank you, Jana, Shweting, and Gitanjali, for sharing your thoughts. It's such a pleasure to be working with each of you in the department and to get to know your work and to see the resonances and the connections in what we do. I think for us, our research and our teaching is not just something we do as a job, but it's something that we care about these issues. We think about how, knowledge operates in society. We care about how, the work that we do brings us, all of us, closer to social justice and human rights and equality. So for us, it's not just something we do for our job, but we're all passionate about this. And I also want to wish all of you on the panel, but also the audience, happy International Women's Day, which is coming up really soon. Thank you, everybody. And I think we can end here. It's a pleasure to hear from all of you. Thank you to the audience for your participation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Alice.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure.